What if everything was connected? Your story, my story, and everyone's story. Love, hate, night, day, and it was all on repeat. What if you recognized the patterns? What if your existence was small and big at the same time? What if you understood life before death? Those questions might be deep, but I think it's important to talk about. Let's connect the dots. Welcome to Connecting the Dots podcast with yours truly, Cody. I know I'm doing a podcast. For a lot of people, this might not be a surprise. For some people, it might be a surprise. Like, man, you doing a podcast now? And to be honest, I've always been apprehensive about the idea of doing a podcast because I'm not into this idea of just talking. Just doing a lot of talking, even though I love to talk. But I'm not in this idea of putting things into the world where it's just revolved around talking. I actually like to, be hands-on with a lot of situations. I've noticed that we live in a digital world now where talking is how messages get traveled, right? A lot of people now, they're not at the park anymore hanging out with the OGs. There's not a lot of in-person connection that I'm noticing. I've been diving deep into the realm of computer science and just really learning about, algorithms and how computers work and the hardware and the software and AI and machine learning and all these different concepts. And it hit me that the internet is one of those things where we've used it for so much good, but at the same token, we've used it for so much bad, just like everything else. And so it hit me one day to take all of my experiences, from personal experiences in which I'll be sharing some certain things with the audience today, but also just my experiences with working with people over the last few years. I've been a personal trainer / coach now, going on near 15, 20 years, just being around so many different personalities, from rich to poor, white, black, gay, straight, Jewish, Muslim, whatever. You name it, I've come across it. I've been around a lot of different individuals in a lot of different high places and in low places. Literally engaging with people that have been locked up for murder, and then engaging with the billionaires that, they're very far removed from the rest of society. It just really hit me that if I did want to do a podcast, if there was something that I did want to put out there, I wanted to put out something that had value. I wanted to put out something that I felt like would help not just the everyday individual, but literally every single person. And the reason why I say it so in that way is because the thing is that the connecting the dots idea is about this idea that we're just a dot. We're just one single dot in one big, large matrix. A matrix that is a web or a net of some sort. And literally, this is how nature is designed. This is how humanity is designed, right? When you look at atoms, when you look at molecules, it all just starts with a very small, singular thing, and then it starts to expand out. And so, over the years, one of the things that I've realized that is something that connects us all is pain, joy, remorse, guilt, all these different emotions, all these different emotions that people go through. And what creates those emotions to be different is the circumstances, the environment, right? Your circumstances is probably your life circumstances, how you grew up as a child, where you grew up at, who was your parents, what was your interactions like when you were a kid. All of these different dynamics that make us human and that actually mold our experiences. And it just got me to this idea of like, well, how can I talk about so much of my experiences with other people, and then also some of my own personal experiences that have given me some insight onto how other people even function. All right, and I'll dive into that more specifically, but the idea of it was, well, you know what? In this day and age, a lot of people talk about a lot of mental health. A lot of people talk about self-development. A lot of people talk about growth and development. All of these things are centered around our human experience, right? All of these things are centered around the idea of, if I want to go out and if I want to go out and be great, well, what does that necessarily consist of? Well, that consists of you facing your demons. The things that eventually, if you don't face them and you get out into the world, well, now it's your demons versus somebody else's demons. And this is the game we play. And so connecting the dots is about abstract ideas, concepts, life lessons that I've learned through my own personal experiences, but also just watching and helping people work through their own personal experiences separate from mine as a trainer, as a coach. Hopefully this podcast is beneficial for those people that are looking to grow, that are looking to evolve, that are looking for more in life. And I just want to basically share the way that I think, the way that I see things, the way that sometimes things come to me, and you'll see me kind of craft and figure my speech, so to speak, figuring it for people to see what I mean when that there are these principles like duality, principles like build and destroy, principles like polarity, principles, these are universal laws that pretty much bound the very universe that we exist in. Now it can go off like very metaphysical, but just if you just think about everyday life and just basic fundamental laws, things such as like discipline, things such as consistency, right? You don't have to go too far to look at how principles, whether it be on an individual level or on a collective level, are very powerful when you put them in practice. So this podcast will have an array of conversations centered around concepts, centered around ideas, and then also having other guests come on and speak about their experiences. You know, for those that know, you know, I'm very in love with martial arts. I'm in love with the idea of self-preservation. And so we'll have some folks on here talking about certain things. We'll have some folks on here that, you know, again, think differently, you know, that may think a little slightly different than the other 95%. You know, there's the 5% that sometimes they may see the world slightly different and they may not fully be understood by the other 95. And so I want to really kind of engage with that 5%. I want to engage and I want to have a conversation. I want us to have a place where we have conversations. It doesn't have to be in the midst of all of the other bullshit that we see what's going on in the world. So, you know, the podcast is for people that are looking to grow, that are looking to develop. This is not a podcast about drama. This is not a podcast about gossip. This is not a podcast about politics. This is not a podcast about any of those things. This is a podcast strictly about growth and development and improving oneself. Now, I want to thank anybody that pushed me, you know, to doing this podcast. There's been a lot of people over the years that are like, Cody, you got to do a podcast, man. When you doing a podcast? And again, like I mentioned before, just wasn't into the whole idea until I really started to understand, you know, and really, when I say understand, I mean really take in that, you know, you got YouTube influencers that are they're more popular than celebrities, right? And so I just really don't come from the idea of being in front of cameras and talking, but I am a grower. I do want to take in as much as I can so I could put out as much as I can. And so here we are. So thank you for those that made the suggestion, pushed me in that direction. And for those that this might be a surprise to them, great. You always have to keep growing. And I want to make sure that whether if I've come across you in the past or I just met you yesterday, there's this idea of growth. And sometimes you got to do things that may not even seem like per se in your lane or something of that nature, right? It's something that you have to constantly keep growing, evolving, and stepping into new things. And learning about the space in itself has been such a growth process. So I just want to thank any future listeners and anybody that pushed me in that direction. Now, quick disclaimer. This podcast is strictly my opinions, my thoughts. I'm not positioning myself as I'm the almighty, I know all. This is more of a podcast talking about things that over the years, being a student of many different teachings, I brought together all of these ideas of things that I felt like just kept coming to me. So I would have a life experience, this idea would come to me, or this concept would come to me. So as these ideas come to me, I would write it down. I would always write down these different ideas from something that I've learned and then something that I've experienced, and then I would just, again, formulate a thought of some sort that, for the most part, it's not nothing new. It's just that, again, I want to bring that 5% conversation on the surface level, right? I want to bring that 5% conversation on the surface level. I want us to have a conversation about what is really good and what is really evil, right? What is this thing we call reality, right? What are these things we call emotions, right? Let's not even go too deep yet. Let's just keep it real simple, like how most people today, like, they want to talk about traumas. A lot of people want to talk about trauma. So let's keep it on that level first. And then as we kind of peel that onion back, we're going to keep going even deeper. Okay. So I said all of that. I said a lot. But what is this first episode about? Well, this first episode is about everybody has a story. And our story is designed to really put us in a situation where I'm a character in some kind of story, right? Like, when you think about a story is a story because there's a place, there's some kind of, it's where it's happening, and then there's a character in the story, right? And then things happen to this character in the story. And so every human being has some level, some story, right? Some people have stories that are very positive, and throughout their whole life, things went just smoothly, right? And then maybe something happened, maybe they got in a car accident, lost an arm, and then it went kind of downhill. And then some people, their story didn't start it off so good, and then it elevated, and then it was like a underdog story, like, whoa, like this person really evolved out of these, out the trenches, so to speak. So this idea that everybody has a story, it was the first thing I wanted to talk about, because what we see is that in the law of duality, and when I speak of laws, again, I'm speaking on just principle of an idea that two, there is a separation, there is a divide, right? So when one turns into two, at some point there was a fork in the road that divided two things, right? And so there was a gentleman that I came across on the internet a few months back. His name is Andrew Bustamante. I don't want to get his wrong name. Andrew Bustamante, incredible podcaster. He has a podcast called Everyday Everyday Spy podcast. Guys, check them out if you're into like certain things. Whether it be, he talks a lot about politics stuff, but he's an ex-CIA agent, so that's why he talks a lot about politics. But he also dives real deep into human psychology. He also dives into a lot of things in which, for example, he said something that highlighted to me something that I always felt and always not struggled with, but always something that I had the ability to do, and it was until recently I understood why. And what that is he broke down this concept that there's a difference between a perspective and perception. And so, okay, Cody, what are you getting at? Well, we all have a story. And when we have a story, we have a perspective of where the character, we have a perspective of what we think. And I say think relatively, what we feel, what we think, everything is a perspective to us in our story. But to the onlookers, to a person that is watching your story, maybe from the TV screen or from whatever, right? You guys are onlookers right now, watching through the phone, that ultimately you have a perception about what you're looking at, right? And we know this. We know about perception. We know about perspective. We know that we all see the world differently and that we understand these things. These are common sense things. Cody, you're not saying anything new. Of course. But look at the world today. The world we live in today is constantly a battle and a fight and an argument and a debate. And it went from verbal in person to now text to video. This is the world we live in. We live in a world of blind, deaf, and dumb people that are arguing because they simply just don't fully understand that it is very difficult to have so many different perspectives and so many different perceptions and then find harmony. How could you? Right? It's difficult. Now the goal is harmony, but it is not a natural occurrence. When you look at nature lives in harmony, right? I mean, I don't know much about squirrels or other animals and stuff, but I don't know. I don't know if they're arguing about Democrat and Republicans or I don't know if they're arguing about that kind of shit. I mean, I could be wrong. I'm not positioning myself as a person that know it all, but what I'm saying is the human being, the human experience is directly correlated to the story of the human being. We study religion. We study stories. The stories have a theme. The stories have a character. The story has a lesson. We're very story orientated because ultimately the story has some kind of beginning, middle, and end. Right? And we want to close that loop. So, okay. Where are we at, Cody? I get it. Perspective, perception. Where are you getting at? Well, what I meant earlier about understanding certain things and not really understanding why, it was because for me, I was forced to a degree to always constantly look at the world from two different angles. I want to lay out my story because there's other people with their stories, but I want to lay out how my story allowed me to then eventually use it as a tool to kind of navigate through the world. So my story starts off by being adopted as a baby. And, well, adoption is, in some cases, happen because some cases it's a situation where people choose it in some capacity, and then there's situations in which there are unfortunate situations that lead up to a child being adopted. And again, I'm not really going to go too deep into my story. And I'm only doing this out of respect for other people that are involved in my story. But I'll share certain things of my story just to give you the severity and the magnitude of the things I had to tap into to then go outward with, right? You have to sometimes go in to go out. So my mother was shot multiple times. My biological mother was shot multiple times by a very crazy man. And again, I'm not going to go too deep into that story because it's really not my story to discuss. It's more so her story. But just know that something very tragic happened to her by someone that was very close to her. And she also eventually witnessed a suicide. All right, she witnessed somebody commit suicide in front of them after she was shot, and eventually went down a real dark path of addiction. And so you can imagine she also had other losses, but you can imagine that when you're going down such a traumatic path, mental health, depression, anxiety, PTSD, all the things that we can sit here and talk about, she was going through that. And drugs, obviously, a lot of people cope with very strong trauma such as that through drugs. And, excuse me. And so ultimately, I was adopted. Now, I'm not going to go too deep into the whole, there's a whole, you want to find out about how people feel about adoption. You can go on TikTok and Instagram, and there's tons of opinions and tons of other thoughts on how people feel about it. I have my own personal feelings about it. I mean, I'm glad that I'm here. I'm glad that I've, survived certain things. There's a lot of things that could have happened to me, and I'm grateful to God, and I'm grateful to the universe to get me here to this point. But I say that to say also that it taught me a very valuable lesson in the sense that the world will look at that, and right there, once I said, I'm grateful, the world will look at that and just shut it down and say, good. Great, see? Yeah. And that's the perception, right? The perception is you made it. You survived. Good. You're strong. And the perspective is you go through every single emotion while others are perceiving you as you're one of the lucky ones, right? Survivor's remorse is part of that because people go to war, they come back from war, people leave the hood and they come back to the hood, and then they deal with these feelings of I survived, but what do I do now? And do I belong here? Should I even have a happy life? Right? And so from early on, as a young man, I was very angry, very confused, very troubled. Didn't get involved in anything too serious, but for the most part, could relate to a lot of things that people went through because, if you're young and you're walking down the street and you see a group of kids making fun of another kid because their mom is strung out on crack on the street, and everybody's perceiving you as well, you don't come from that, but they don't know nothing about you. They don't know anything about you, but you know yourself and you know your story, and therefore you have a perspective. You have a perspective, they have a perception, and this is life. And this happens in every capacity. So from young, as a young kid, I always had this thing where I could literally, after a while, I became a tool with let me put myself in this person's shoes and see what they're doing and see how it feels. And that's where Coaching came into play. Now, I'm not saying I'm an expert at this in every way possible. Trust me. There's a lot of times that I don't get my wife's perspective, for example, or just other people's perspective. And by the way, this is not an all and be all truth, but the concept is the perspective versus perception causes a duality, causes a split. It causes this good, this bad, this right, this wrong, this satisfied, dissatisfied, the constant splits of endless amounts of separation, of division. This is law. This is law. This is something that is law. And so my story evolved more and more, but just to give you the basis, just to give you the foundation, that gave me the tool to walk in the world where if I saw something I didn't fully understand, if I didn't fully understood it, if I didn't understand it, I was conditioned to judge it. But now, as I've gotten older, as I got more mature, as I evolved more, now I take a moment and I just try to walk through that person. And then you hear again, the next split is what? Empathy and sympathy. Because then you could have sympathy for something, right? You could have sympathy for a person that is struggling, for example. Like you see them struggling and you're like, oh man, that looks rough. Or you can have empathy for a person. Like, man, I remember when I was going through that. Let me go and help them. Empathy usually leads to some form of action because you could feel it in your cells, you could feel it in your body. It starts to press on your pain points. It starts to press on your triggers. That's why empathy is so strong. Now, why do I bring up empathy and sympathy? Well, perspectives bring about a lot of empathy. But when you have perspectives and perceptions constantly, then you're going to have a mixed bag of empathy, sympathy, empathy, sympathy. You're going to have a mixed bag of where like, I don't really care about what happens over there because it doesn't really affect me, right? It's like I care because it's wrong, like it doesn't look right, but it doesn't affect me. And so we live in this world where that is the constant. And that's another law. It's constant. It's a loop. So you get into this cycle. You get into this cycle of perspective, perception, sympathy, empathy, my emotion versus your emotion. Let's go a layer deeper. So we have our personal, this would happen to me, right? Perspective. This is my trauma. This happened to me. But then we also have a collective. There's a larger trauma and pain or story outside of yours. You're part of a much bigger web. This is the connecting of the dot theory, right? So again, to share more of me so I could make it deeper and more personal is, so adopted. Mom was on drugs. Mom got cleaned up. Mom got cleaned up on the day that I was born. So, congratulations to her. Every birthday, it's also congratulations to her. Now, why am I bringing this up? There's these points. You know, like it just so happens that on my birthday, the day I was born, she chooses to get herself out of a dark place. So her evolution is sometimes based upon my birth. And we have this constant connection of points that are always happening, that if we are aware of it, we can appreciate it and almost see the path. You can actually start seeing how things are mapping out, so to speak, right? And we'll dive deeper in later episodes of of ancient people that had the ability to weed through the laws of physics, weed through the laws of the universe. Probably just walk through and get into another dimension. Sounds crazy, but we thought AI was crazy. And trust me, based off my research I've been doing, it's about to get crazier. So the reality of it is that we have all of these different points. And the next point that came after many years later was my daughter being born. My daughter being born forced me to face a lot of myself. It forced me to, well, it was the first time I actually physically met my own biological blood with no engineering involved. No calling of an agency, none of that. It was your daughter. She sees me and she's like, that's my dad. And for a person that was stripped, right? Because what people have to understand is that there's something called a primal wound, right? And again, you can go and do your own research and go deep into this, but there's this idea that if you take a baby and you strip them, this has happened throughout history in many scenarios where if you strip a baby away from the mother, because the mother was carrying the baby in the womb for so long, 10 months, that's all they know, that when you strip that baby apart at such an early age, in such the early periods in which those connections have to happen, it literally changes the biology of the baby. It literally changes the way in which how you interact socially and emotionally and just everything about you. It literally disrupts that. Now, it could be repaired. It takes a lot of work, but you don't have the head start like others do in some capacities. My daughter being born allowed me to really face myself, because when you have a young child looking at you, they also see your father, your mother, your uncle. They see your whole past. They see your whole future. Children are like literal gifts from God. They come directly from the source. The dead is going back, children are coming in. And so when they look at you, they're looking right past through every wall you grew or put up. And so for me, I did the work. I dived in. Did a lot of crying. Did a lot of therapy. I did a lot of work. But it was necessary work because it helped me and allowed me to grow so I could be the right father for her, but also just the right person for myself to navigate in this world in which the famous line, hurt people hurt people. And we have a whole generation due to social media, due to non-stop, non-in-person interactions where you're not getting a full feel for people. You're not getting a real connection with people. It's a fabricated connection digitally through audio waves and pixels, and it fabricates the connection that we would once feel if we were in the room together. It's not the same. I didn't want to continue the cycle. So I did work, a lot of work, still doing a lot of work. This is part of it. And so the next connection point was, okay, I gotta meet the other person. I gotta meet the father. I gotta meet my dad. Never got to meet him yet, but I found him. And when I found him, I got what I was looking for. a person that was completely emotionally unavailable. Now, that is my perception. That is my perception of him. And I say that because he has a story. His story wasn't all that either. His story was kind of fucked up. He's Italian. I also found out his mom, my grandmother, was Jewish, and her grandparents were Holocaust survivors. And when they came here into America, he had a rough childhood and grew up no love, no affection. And like most men in the 80s, went out, did their thing, and dipped out. And he did that with a lot of them. So if I got any brothers and sisters out there that's watching this, all right, we out here. And I found another brother. I mean, guys, if I go about my personal story, it just gets interesting, and it will open up dialogue in the future with others. But for the most part, these dots connected for me. What did these dots point out to me? What did all of this point out? It pointed out that I was in a cycle of trauma. Right? I was in a cycle of trauma. His grandparents. Okay, my mom. What happened to her? My other grandmother. Well, she was adopted. And, well, put it like this. She wasn't adopted. She was abandoned. And she was abandoned because she was black. Because during Jim Crow, interracial, no. So somebody left a black baby on somebody's doorstep somewhere in Florida. And they found that baby and they was like, oh, okay. It's a baby out here. So confusion, pain, no direction, no guidance, no support. These things that it's embedded in our family trees. It's embedded in our genes. It's embedded in us. Now, you'll hear people say, well, you could think your way out of it. Listen, fam, there's a lot of stuff buried in you. And this is why it's important to tap into the body. Because the body is the first layer. When you get through the body, you start tapping more into your spirit. Because your body is a vessel that essentially teaches you have something that you have to be responsible for. That's why I got into fitness. Because ultimately, I went from an emotion that got me so angry if I wanted to go and risk my, whether it be freedom or life or whatever it is, to go do something stupid, to be involved in something that is dumb. I worked out. I hung out around people that worked out. And I like the idea that motivation and drive, and where there's a will, there's a way mentality. Whether if it came from a person that did 30 years in prison, if it came from a person that was in a war as a Marine, it didn't matter to me. Or if it was a Wall Street, hedge fund guy, whoever that's worth millions and billions of dollars, and he wakes up 5:30 in the morning to blow up some steam before, regardless of whatever the story was, I realized that the body is that people tap into. Right? It's like music. It's a vibration. Music brings people together. That's why, like, during civil rights movement, people music brought people together. Music is humor is what brings people together. Laughter. Being sad sometimes brings people together. Emotions is what brings us together. It's where you start to see the harmony come into play, where all of our different pain points start to connect. All of our joy points start to connect. Why do I really appreciate this concept? Because I had to engineer the idea of what it felt like for family to feel real. Right? It didn't come natural to me. It was something, you're a little kid and you're like living somewhere and it's like, this is not your like actual biological family, but it's your family. And so you operate as such. So it's like literally like if you're a character, you're Batman, but now you're in Superman universe and you like, you have your own universe, but you just in Superman. And you're okay with that. Breaking a cycle is really hard. Breaking a cycle is really hard because you have to face a lot of stuff. You have to. And if you have kids, I highly encourage you break any cycle that you have. Because if you don't, you're essentially going to pass that on to them in a very indirect way. And breaking cycles is not just buying stuff for kids or, just even being there. Breaking a cycle is, how do they see you in the world? Right? Like how do they see you? I work on that so much. Like I want to work on, not that I care about how the people see me, but I care most importantly about if I have a hard time being kind. I have a hard time being kind. I'm gonna admit to that. There are times where I'm not kind. My daughter would tell me, "You're not being kind, Daddy." And so I realize if she sees me and I'm not being kind, then she'll see me as an unkind person. And then when she gets older, even though the generations now have these like traumas, but it's like, you ain't have to see nobody's brains get blown out, right? Not to make it so bleak, but the idea is that, and I'm not minimizing anybody's experience, but there's magnitudes of things. There's things on scales, and the overall objective is that we should always be aiming to get better. Emotionally, spiritually, physically, mentally. You're never done. You're not done. It's not like, okay, I made it. Never. You'll be 80, 90, 100 years old. There's something that's still, before you go back to where you came from, still something you gotta work on. One of the other reasons why I started this podcast is about the end of last year is when I really started to get into computer science and just YouTube University, teaching myself Python, teaching myself different coding techniques, and just, by the way, don't know nothing, but learning is something that I love to do. I love to learn and try to increase my knowledge on things. And with technology today, what's the excuse? What's the excuse? Like, you can pretty much do anything you want to do today. And so it made me really dive deep into this idea of computer science. And naturally, having a science degree in exercise science, I like to pick things apart, and I want to really understand what's going on underneath the hood. And coding and just software development and programming and how things operate between a software and hardware in a computer, you start to realize like how literally our energy is starting to morph into another frequency. What I mean by that is this. When you take water, fire, dirt, wind, you take all of the elements, you start to build land, you start to build structure, you start to build organisms. Organisms start to replicate. And then they start to compete, and they start to think, and they start to innovate, and they start to constantly keep growing and evolving. This is how the evolution, you watch it grow in this way. And then now here we are. We have computers. We have the internet. I can email you. You can text me. I can send you a video. We could stream movies. We're disrupting industries now because we have the internet. And it all comes down to simple zeros and ones. Zeros and ones, and electricity and transmitters and signals and frequencies and vibrations and algorithms and all of these different things that I started to learn and understand, data structures and variables and functions and all of these different things that I'm like, wait, hold on, this is what happens in the real world, right? Social media. We're going to have an episode on this. Social media is a loop. That's all social media is you like something, your friends like something, or different data points have been collected on you, and we're just going to keep feeding you stuff. Now they don't even need to personally attack you. They just look at what the collective is looking at and then feed that out. So everybody talking about Diddy? Cool. More Diddy. Politics? Cool. Right? Like, there's real shit going on in the world, and the algorithm is designed to keep you blind, deaf, and dumb. Now, your experience, the user experience is, they don't feel like somebody is stealing from them. You don't feel like someone's stealing your time, stealing your data, stealing your attention, it doesn't feel like that. And in some instances, you actually feel productive. You may say, well, today I learned how to, scrub whatever. And I'm not knocking anybody I do it. But when I started to learn and understand, you almost look at things like, oh wow, this is how they make Coca-Cola so good. You start to really understand like the product, and you start to really understand that consumer and creator. And this is the world we live in. We live in a world full of consumers and a world of creators. And so the technology basically is mirroring how we are evolving. So if we evolve and we're just like a bunch of like sheep and just, we're just eating, we just eating. And then there's a few people out here that's feeding them. This is the world we live in. This is what's happening. So when we cover certain episodes in future episodes, when we have conversations about duality, when we have conversations about build and destroy, when we look at concepts and principles, we have to understand that we either use these things for better or for worse, right? Are we going to use this technology? Are we going to use this means of communication to expand our consciousness, to elevate, to go beyond? Or are we going to use this to constantly just be entertained, and so it doesn't feel too bad? Whatever pain or whatever it is that you're dealing with, whatever depression, whatever anxiety, whatever thing that you're trying to procrastinate on, whatever it is, like if you're spending time doing something and you only have a limited time here on earth, you should be looking at the ROI. You should be looking at, like, for example, sleep. We sleep a large portion of our lives. And, it's like the quality of our sleep sucks. I know my quality of sleep sucks. And a lot of our quality of sleep sucks. So we should improve it, right? But it's hard to improve and it's a cycle. And we try to constantly figure out how to break out these webs, which we'll talk more about. So definitely going to cover a lot when it comes to concepts and abstract ideas and much more that we're going to be discussing. So I just want to thank you guys for tuning in. If you sat through a whole hour long or whatever this is going to be, whatever this is going to add up to, and you sat here and you listened to me talk, I appreciate the listen. Go ahead, hit the like and subscribe. And if there's anything that I said on here today that maybe resonates, that maybe you have a story and maybe there was some dots that had to connect for you, and maybe you have some dots that you want to talk about, we can have you on the podcast if you're open to that and you're maybe vulnerable enough to do that. But the point is that I want to thank those that are tuning in. I want to thank to the future listeners out there. And again, if there's anything that I've said here, please share, like and subscribe. Peace and love.
Hey, nowadays the pain follow me. Deal with trauma privately. I don't wanna be a burden, I handle things defiantly. Spent a decade searching for a higher power guiding me. Figured out that faith is not up there, that it's inside of me. Act with execution, what's a plan with zero action? Faced with bad habits, knowing it's a magnet to my imbalance. I'm somewhere between confidence and arrogance. The middle ground is treacherous, I work on getting out of it.